Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today. It's Wednesday morning, April 28th. 2021. Good morning, Jennifer, Sheila, Diana, Lyle, Brian, and Gail. Glad to have everybody on here today. We are working our way through the book of James. Hey, Joni. And we are ready for James chapter 3 today, as you can see on your screen. And this is a... Good morning, Cindy. This is a very practical... the book of James itself is... I kind of call it the book of everyday Christianity. Good morning, Diana. And James chapter 3 is just... Man, it's so full of stuff that we all need. I guess that's the best way to say it. Stuff that we all need. Good morning, Linda. James chapter 3 is about the tongue. So let's get started here. In the first two verses, you have an imperative. There's a warning here about teachers. Hello, Patricia. A warning here about not just teachers, but about being a self-appointed teacher, about seeking that position. This is a warning. Now, to some extent, every Christian is a teacher. Hello, Anna from Reelfoot Lake. Glad to have you. To some extent, every Christian is a teacher. We all have the responsibility to reach out to those who are outside of Christ, those who are lost. Hey, David, you are back. Well, good to have you back, David. Hope you're doing well. We all have that responsibility to reach out to the lost, to reach out even to those who, Paul talks about, for instance, in Galatians chapter 6, and James does, in fact, in James chapter 5. Those who have fallen away, the way James says it in James 5, is those who have erred from the faith. Good morning, Barry and Glenda. Hope you guys are doing well. But while it is the case that we are all in that sense teachers, it is also the case that not every Christian either is qualified to teach in what I would say is a public setting. All right, and I think that's what we're dealing with here in James chapter 3. Not just not qualified to teach, but not prepared. Teaching, whether you're talking about like a Bible class or presenting a sermon, as we call it, takes a lot of preparation, hours of work for a 20 to 30 minute discussion, if you will. A lot of digging, a lot of effort, and experience helps. There's no question about that. But anyway, let's get to the text here and let's read about this warning. My brethren, James 3, 1 and 2, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. I forget exactly how. Let me pull out my King James here real quick. I forget how the King James says it. I know it reads a little differently in the King James Version. We shall receive a greater condemnation. Okay. I kind of prefer the New King James there. We shall receive a stricter judgment because, the teacher is responsible for himself. Just for instance, Paul told Timothy, 1 Timothy 4, I think it's verse 16. Good morning, Miss Louise. Take heed to thyself. There's number one. A teacher can disqualify himself or herself by their manner of life. So take heed unto yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them. So, it's interesting. Read there. We're not going to do it now, but you read 1 Timothy 4, verses 13 through 16, and Paul emphasizes that need greatly, to take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. He tells Timothy there, while I'm gone, give attention to reading. A teacher needs to know the Word. And so this warning here then in James chapter 3, don't be desirous, selfishly ambitious, if you will, because that's going to kind of come out later in the text here of James chapter 3, selfish ambition, to become a teacher in that way, because a teacher is, in a sense, held to a higher, a stricter judgment, a stricter form of judgment. Because, again, number one, you have to take heed to yourself, but then number two, the people who are listening to you, you're going to have to give an account for them, in a sense. I understand that judgment is individualistic. I get that. Hey, Mom. we're going to stand before God as individuals, but if I as an individual teacher mislead a group of people, I think I'm going to have to give an account for that. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, complete, fully developed, if you will, able also to bridle his whole body. And the word bridle there means, in the Greek language, it means to bit lead. And he's going to use an illustration for that here in just a minute. So that's an imperative here in verses 1 and 2. You better be careful about a selfish ambition, a selfish desire to become a teacher, because a teacher is going to stand with a stricter judgment. A lot of responsibility with that opportunity to teach. So be very careful with that. Verses 3 through 5, he then illustrates what he's talking about with the tongue. And again, that's mainly what James 3 is about, is the tongue. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths. And again, that word bridle in verse 2 means to bit lead. And in fact, James uses that same word. If you look back in chapter 1 and verse 26, if any of you thinks he is religious and does not bit lead his tongue, you don't bridle, you don't control your tongue, your religion is useless. So what does this mean? Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us. And that's another interesting word, that they may obey us. It comes from the Greek word peitho, P-E-I-T-H-O, and it's the idea of persuasion. You're leading them by persuasion. You persuade a horse to go in a certain direction by the bit that's in his mouth and by control of the reins. And so we as it says here, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may be persuaded by us. And we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. Even so those are his two illustrations, horses and boats. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. So the tongue here, there's a very stern warning for Christians on the usage of the tongue. It's an imperative. Don't be a self-appointed teacher. Don't be selfish, conceited, because a teacher is going to have a stricter judgment. Consider the horses and the ships. And so he's going to launch into how the tongue is used by people. And again, words of warning here. Verse 6, the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. Man, verse 6, that's that verse is full of fire. It's the nature of the tongue, and we understand James is not he's not talking about the physical, well, I guess he is in a sense, the thing that's in your mouth, behind your teeth. It's the usage of that thing. It's the usage of the tongue. That's what we're dealing with here. And the way we use our tongue, and I would say we've all experienced this to one extent or another. Perhaps we ourselves have been at fault here. We have set on fire the course of nature. All right, we've set our own world on fire, or we've set someone else's world on fire by the use or the misuse of our tongue, or maybe by not using our tongue at all. So James 3 and verse 6, the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. Your tongue can open the door to so many bad things. You know, you could. So I did a topical study through the book of Proverbs several years ago. It's on our website, MammothSpringChurchOfChrist.com. And the tongue, man, you read about the tongue in the book of Proverbs. It opens the door to a lot of, it can be to a lot of good things. But it seems to me, the way I look at James here and the warnings that James gives, and having studied it extensively in the book of Proverbs, man, the tongue can open the door to a lot of negative things in the world. So we have to be very careful. So let's continue here. James 3 and verse 7, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Again, how many times have each of us in our life said something, maybe in the heat of the moment, in anger, or in maybe in defense, self-defense, or defense of somebody else. And we have spoken before we've taken the time to think about what we're about to say, about the consequences of what we're about to say. I know I have. I know that. And I would say probably all of us have done that. So again, James touches on this so much. You go back to James chapter 1 and verse 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak. Slow to speak. Too many times we're ready just to fire something off without thinking through. And there are some differences there with each of us as humans. Some people can think more quickly on their feet, as we say. Some take more time to think, and I guess even if you can think quickly on your feet, it's probably still good to take a little time to think before you speak. I think of Jesus' warnings, and Jesus' warning. It's in Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37. Every idle word we speak, we will give an account of in the day of judgment. Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37. That's a very strong warning. So verse 8 here, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father. Okay, that's what Christians do. And this is what Christians do. And with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. And his conclusion of that is, out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. It shouldn't be that way. But the fact of the matter is, you go back up to verse 8, the tongue is set in our body, and it's used in such a way as to make it a challenge to keep it tamed all the time. You think of animals. All right, we can domesticate animals. But those animals can they're animals. They don't have a conscience. They have instinct. They have nature. And there are even times when animals who have been domesticated, they'll lash out at you. You can provoke them. They'll lash out at you. Even though they may to some extent be tamed or domesticated, they're still animals. And that's kind of the picture of the tongue here. We can domesticate it. We can keep it under control. Again, you go back to chapter 1, verse 26. If you don't bridle your tongue, your religion is useless. So the implication there is we can bridle the tongue, and we don't want to make our religion useless. But just like an animal that has been domesticated will sometimes lash out, our tongue can do that very same thing. And so we need to be very careful. And again, contextually, he's talking to teachers here. Be very careful, my brethren. These things ought not to be so. We'll bless God, and then we'll turn around a minute later and we'll curse our fellow man. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. We have such a responsibility to control our tongue, to use it in the best way that we can. Debbie says, such a small member of our body that can bring forth both great good and great evil. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. So it can bring forth blessing and cursing. That's why you go back up to verse 6, or rather the end of verse 5. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. Just a little spark can set off a massive wildfire. And that exact same thing is true with the tongue. A little word, again, maybe out of anger, maybe out of resentment, maybe again just in the heat of the moment. A few words, a few sentences can set your nature, can set your world on fire. And that's something that we all need to take heed to. All right, let's move on here, beginning in verse 13. Yeah, okay, so Connie, that's a good point. Not only what we say, but how we say it. Sure. That's kind of one of the dangers of I would say modern technology, texting and messaging, things like that. When you're texting somebody, you can't see their body language. You can't hear the inflection in their voice. So, watching your tongue nowadays is more than just what you what is audible, what can be heard by somebody else. It's even using your screen and your thumbs or your keyboard. Got to be careful. All right, let's talk about heavenly wisdom versus earthly wisdom here. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. Wisdom, it's an old saying, I guess, a cliche. There's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is the obtaining of facts, the obtaining of information. Wisdom is how do we apply now the facts, the information that we have gathered. And so from the Christian perspective, we've gathered all this information from the Word of God. So we need to show then by good conduct that our works are done in the meekness of wisdom. How do I apply the practical things, the tongue? How do I apply those practical things to my life on a daily basis? But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking, some versions there say in verse 14, selfish ambition. And that's why, to me, that's why James 3 in verses 1 and 2 is warning about becoming teachers. It seems that he's addressing those who have a selfish ambition to become a teacher. It's not selfish to be a teacher. Again, every Christian has that responsibility to one extent or another. But to seek that selfishly for personal gratification, for position, for authority, if you will. If you have that in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom, if you're doing things out of conceit and things like this wisdom does not descend from above. It is earthly, sensual, and demonic. Sheila says Jesus taught us a lot by his silence while under distress. I tell you what, Sheila brings up a good point there. So I'm going to flip over here just real quick since you mentioned it. 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 20. Verse 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. So that's exactly right. We learn a lot about the use of our tongue, our mouth. You think of all the charges that were brought against Jesus in his trials. Going on 5 different trials all night long into the early morning. And the only time he would answer a question would be a very specific question. Are you the king of the Jews? You've said it. But when people were brought against him, making false accusations and lying about him, the biblical text tells us that he remained silent. So good point there. Sheila? So this wisdom that is self-seeking, this selfish ambition, is earthly, sensual, and demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. And so again, I think that's the broader context of, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers. It's a warning against conceit. It's a warning against selfish ambition. Because when you act that way, you stir up, what does it say? Confusion and evil things. So we got to be careful. The wisdom that is from above is first pure. It's unmixed. It's unadulterated. It's not mixed up with selfish conceit. It's not mixed up with a desire for power and control. Then it's peaceable. So if you are conceited, if you are selfishly ambitious, you don't seek peace. You seek power. You seek control. Then it's gentle. It's willing to yield. Willing to yield. A conceited, selfish, self-centered person is not willing to yield. It's full of mercy and good fruits. It's without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness, that is what righteousness produces, what it brings forth, is sown in peace by those who make peace. So just a lot of down-to-earth stuff here throughout the entire book of James, but particularly here all through chapter 3, the use of the tongue and the warnings against a selfish, conceited, power-hungry desire to be a teacher. You better be careful, because we will receive a stricter judgment, a harsher condemnation. What does the King James say? Greater condemnation. Teachers have a great responsibility and they need to be very careful in their role as a teacher. All right, guys, that is James chapter 3. Appreciate the comments and all the greetings. Had a good number on here today. I saw upwards of 27 on the live stream this morning. I don't see any further comments, but I appreciate the ones that were given to us. Well, tomorrow is the last day of the week for the live stream, so we'll come back tomorrow and we'll look at James chapter 4, which actually picks up on the thought of selfish conceit, or selfish ambition and conceit, power grabs and things like that. Wars and fightings were present in the church, and James addresses that in James chapter 4, so we'll get to that tomorrow. Appreciate y'all being on here today. As always, questions or comments after the stream's over, you can access it here. All this stuff is uploaded to our YouTube channel. The comment sections are open there too. So, all right, guys. Hope you have a good day, and I hope to see you back here. Thank you, Diana. Hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we will study James chapter 4 together. Have a good day.